made me wonder when I saw empty towns as we traveled across California. One day, I asked my father what they were doing here in the desert, with nobody for miles around. It wasn't always like this, he said. Not long ago, there were men all through this area coming to see the elephant. What do you mean, I asked, seeing the elephant? Well, my father said, once there was a farmer who wanted to see an elephant. Hearing that a circus was in town, he loaded his wagon with goods and set out to find it. Along the way, he came across the circus animals. His horse became frightened, spilling the farmer and his goods in a ditch. But the farmer didn't care about the damage, for at last, he had seen an elephant. The men who came here were like the farmer. They also wanted to see something. It all started in 1849, shortly after California was won from Mexico.
I came from Salem City with my washbowl on my knee. I'm going to California, the gold is for to see. It rained all night the day I left, the weather it was dry. The sun so hot I froze to death, oh brothers don't you cry. Oh California, that's the land for me. I'm going to Sacramento with my washbowl on my knee.
A man working on a sawmill picked up some rocks in the water. And soon the word was out. There was gold in California. All a man had to do was look for it, and he would have a fortune. There were plenty of men with a thirst for adventure, men with visions.
When formed our band, we are all well manned to journey afar to the promised land. The golden ore is rich in store on the banks of the Sacramento shore. Then ho, boys, ho, to California go. There's plenty of gold in the world, I'm told, on the banks of the Sacramento shore.
Within a short time, all had caught the fever that only gold would quench. The 49ers, they were called, and seeing the elephant became their motto. It was not easy to get to California. There were overland trails, but they took many months. A man could look forward to walking most of the way. The West was still a wilderness, filled with mountains, swift rivers, hostile Indians, and deserts. For the men living along the East Coast, the best way to California was by ship. This 13,000-mile journey around South America would take from several months to a year. If one didn't get seasick, there were always severe storms, cold weather, bad food, and the lack of anything to do on board ship for many months. Some decided to take a shortcut across Panama, where there was the danger of getting malaria or other jungle diseases. Despite all the problems, people continued to come in great numbers. Sometimes whole crews of ships deserted to look for gold, and the harbor of San Francisco soon became filled with abandoned boats. In only a few short years, this once quiet town grew to a large, bustling port. On its streets, one could hear many different languages. San Francisco was the Golden Gateway. From there, men went north. The hardships were just beginning. There was gold in the mountains and streams, but first, one had to find it. Most were ill-prepared to go looking. In fact, many had no idea what to look for or where they should start. If anyone got sick with cholera or broke his leg, he was done for. There were no doctors in the mountains, except those who also were looking for gold. The dollar was worth more than twice as much then, but in the gold fields, provisions were very expensive. $6 for a dozen eggs if one was lucky enough to find them. There were hardly any roads in California, so a man had to carry his provisions on his back. Only a few were lucky enough to afford a mule. But with high hopes, the 49ers began to walk into the wilderness. Sleeping under the stars might be pleasant in fair weather, but when it rained or snowed, there was nothing to do but wait it out. Many 49ers wrote about their adventures.
Dearest Annie, well, here I am in the gold fields. Went to Sutter's Mill where the first gold was discovered. We hear news of rich strikes every day. One man found about $40,000 worth and spent it all on dinner and drinks in Sacramento. The dollar here is hardly worth more than a dime back home. And even if you make a big strike, you have to be careful. Several men were murdered for their claim just last week. As soon as it stops raining, I'll be off to where they say there's a gold vein as thick as a man's fist running clear across the mountainside. It won't be long now before I'm bound to find enough to come back home and buy you the house I promised.
It took luck to find gold and skill to live off the land. Many men didn't know how to hunt, and after looking for gold all day, they had very little energy left to look for food.
We'll expect our share of the course's fare and sometimes sleep in the open air. On the cold, damp ground, we'll all sleep sound except when the wolves go howling round.
Meals had to be of items that would last and could easily be carried, like salt pork, beans, and black coffee. People unfamiliar with the land were easy prey to those who made a living off of deception. Maps of claims were sold which proved worthless. And for those who kept looking, there were many ways to find gold. Sifting gravel and dirt in streams was known as panning. The lighter material floated away, leaving the heavier gold-carrying sediment at the bottom. Few men expected the hard work that was necessary. Backs ached at night from the long hours of bending over. Hands and feet were often numb from working in the cold streams. In order to make it easier to find gold, many began to use a cradle, which made the job move faster. Some gold was found in the mountainsides. Trenches were dug and layers of dirt carefully searched.
The gold is there almost anywhere. We dig it out rich with an iron bar, but where it is thick with spade or pick, we take out chunks as big as a brick.
As the gold became more difficult to find, men went deeper into the ground, digging mines. The search for gold was financed by large companies who employed new methods and equipment. gold was found, camps sprang up, and overnight, scores of tents might appear. Miners were always ready to move wherever a new strike was made. Rules governing the size of claims were immediately set up. Where the diggings were rich, the size of the claim was likely to be small. A camp store would be erected out of cloth and boards. Often it would become a hotel and serve as a saloon, too. This was the center of social life for the miners. The men would gather to drink or gamble or dance, waiting until Sunday to come so they could go to town. Towns were hurriedly constructed near the diggings to provide the services that the miners wanted. Within a year, there was likely to be a blacksmith shop. It was important to keep the mules and horses well shod, for besides walking, they were still the only means of traveling in the California mountains. Having a horse could make the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Doctors were always needed. Some of them had come to look for gold, but to go back to their original calling. Pharmacists soon opened up shops. Medicines of all types were made from scratch. Lucky, and if he did, there might be a pill or to help him. There were no hospitals to go to, and all one could sometimes do. A miner would have his gold tested at the assayer's office, if he was able to get this far before he spent it. Stagecoach lines would bring in other hopeful miners, as well as gamblers, and the much-awaited mail. Town was the place to go. It was where a miner could be entertained, and the best place to start was often the saloon. There were women here, unlike the camps where the sight of a woman was enough to cause a celebration. Why, in one camp, when the men heard that a woman was on her way, she was met on the road, and she and her mule were carried all the way back. But even in the towns, there were so few women that when one arrived, she was often presented with gold dust by the happy miners. Everything was measured by gold. One bought a drink or two with a pinch of gold dust, valued at about $1. A teaspoonful was about $16, and a wine glassful was considered worth $100. A man might find a fortune and spend it in one night. For some men, the journey to town ended in the jail. Miners often had too much to drink and got into fights. At first, there was no law, but as robberies and murders increased, the citizenry began to ask for something to be done. In places like San Francisco, a vigilante group was formed, taking law and order into its own hands. Hanging was a common punishment. In a place where it was hard to come by most goods, stealing a man's tools or his horse might cost the robber his life. Merchants like the Murphy brothers took in as much as $400 a day in gold dust, becoming richer than most of the miners. For every rich man, there were thousands who remained poor. By 1853, some of the first miners started back home. The easy digs were becoming more difficult to find. Mining companies were replacing the individual prospectors. And where once the streets had been filled with activity, as the gold gave out, people moved away. Peace and quiet now reigned. Only the buildings remained to let the passerby know that once there were men here who had seen the elephant. And for those who had, there would never be anything like it. It didn't matter if one found gold or not. It was enough to have been part of one of the greatest adventures of all time, the gold rush in California.